Dr. Linda Hazzard had a cure for what ailed the men and women of the world, but little did they know it would cost them more than just their money. It would cost them their lives. Welcome to Spooky Tales of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Hello and welcome to Spooky Tales of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. I'm Jennifer. So today we are going to be talking about a woman who used to live in Olalla, Washington. She styled herself as a doctor of sorts, and I use that term extremely loosely. I don't know if anybody in Washington or around Washington has ever heard of this woman, but I do know that that there has been books written about her, and I know a lot of true crime podcasts have covered her, so to speak. Anyway, so the today's episode is going to be about Linda Burfield Hazzard. She was a woman who considered herself smart and intelligent and good at what she did and could cure anything and everything. And unfortunately, what she would prescribe to people more often than not led to their deaths rather than any kind of cure for their various ailments. She has a book written about her. I will actually link that book in the show notes because some of the information that I got for this episode came from that book and a few articles written about that book. And it is called Starvation Heights by Gary Olson. And I think it's Gary. I think it might be Greg. And it's the information in there is pretty interesting, and he does write a pretty good book. But yeah, without further ado, Linda Hazzard was born in 1867 as Linda Laura Burfield in Carver, Minnesota. And she was the oldest of Susan Neal Burfield and Montgomery Burfield's 7 children. Montgomery had been a corporal in the 9th Minnesota Infantry during the Civil War. And 10 years after Linda's birth, the family moved to Star Lake Township to build a homestead while Montgomery ran a log mill. Excuse me, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It's probably loud. Even as a child, Linda was pretty confident and outgoing. She was known to be a tomboy, and she was actually her father's favorite child, which don't tell your children who your favorite children are. And according to a Fergus Falls Daily Journal article that was written in 1931, this is the direct quote from that article, she was a strange child, and her parents were told she would do weird things and lead an unusual life. From the first, it was evident she was different from other children, and she was inclined to be haughty, high-strung, and visionary. Linda spent many hours communing with herself instead of joining with others in their childish activities. That doesn't necessarily, being described that way as a child isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, I probably was described as a tomboy who spent most of her time with her face in a book than anything else. And that doesn't make me, well, okay, maybe it does make me strange and unusual, but that doesn't make me a murderer. So there we go. The Starvation Heights, which is the book that was written about Linda, author Greg Olson, wrote that for that day and the time, the family did some pretty strange things. They led a mostly vegetarian diet, and in that time, the majority diet was basically meat and potatoes because that was the cheapest and most available thing for most people that weren't the elite, the aristocracy and stuff like that to afford. So it's not unusual that the majority diet would be meat and potatoes. It is unusual for a family of 10 to basically only eat a vegetarian diet in that time and that age. Apparently, for no reason whatsoever, Montgomery Burfield decided that all of his children needed to see a doctor, a real quote unquote one. No one was sick or even looked like they needed a doctor, but that didn't seem to really matter to him, and they saw one anyway. The doctor prescribed the entire family a blue mass pill. I have really bad handwriting, so sometimes I can't read my own handwriting. And according to Greg Olson, the author of Starvation Heights, these pills were some kind of purgatory, and it induced vomiting and diarrhea. That is a terrible way to be treated for anything unless you have like a reason to be treated for, like, you're poisoned or something like that. Then you can, like, if it's safe to do so, vomit everywhere. Later in Linda's life, she would blame this irreparable damage to her intestines. Oh, blame this for, see, there I go again, can't read my own handwriting. Blame this for irreparable damage to her intestines. Young Linda was extremely underweight, tired, and she could barely keep anything down. So, of course, she was prescribed more purgatives to cleanse her stomachs of its maladies. She would blame this for the loss of most of her teeth, which vomiting can absolutely destroy the enamel and structure of your teeth, and it can cause them to rot away and fall out no matter, what kind of things you do to keep them there. People who suffer from anorexia nervosa and more often than not bulimia do have this issue as well because the constant purging destroys their teeth. Excuse me, I had to take a drink of coffee. This entire experience would drive an interest in alternative health treatments for Linda, and she would work really hard to develop this interest in this health treatment. When Linda was about 18, she married a man named Irwin Perry, who was 14 years her senior, and I have in parentheses the word gross written because that's quite disgusting. After they were wed, they moved to Fergus Falls, Minnesota, where they had 2 children, Roland in 1889 and Nina Floy in 1891. Gray Olson wrote in his book that Linda had a greater and grander things in mind for herself, and that she quickly lost interest in her marriage because it was not what she thought she was getting into. Linda had some pretty heavy social ambitions and a pretty deep-seated need to associate with a better class, the upper echelon of this day and age, and the aristocracy, and all that kind of stuff. Those were the people that Linda wanted to associate with. All of this may have gotten the family into some pretty severe financial troubles. She, quote, demanded the best clothes and the smartest turnouts from her husband's stables, end quote, Olson also wrote. In 1898, Linda claimed that Irwin abandoned her, but those who knew her thought that was a bald-faced lie. Linda actually sent her children off to Star Lake, where her parents lived, and basically her mother, Susan, would more or less raise them for the rest of their lives. Olson wrote in his book that Linda really couldn't be bothered with motherhood, or apparently being married to Irwin Perry. In 1898, also, it began Linda's obsession with fasting. There was a book that was written by a Dr. Edward Hooker Dewey called The Gospel of Health, and it actually praised the restorative powers of fasting. Dewey wrote in his book that every disease that affects mankind, more or less habitual, eating in excess of the supply of gastric juices. Basically, you're eating too much for your stomach to keep up with itself, and you need to throw it all up and you'll be better. That's basically what that says. Or you should not eat at all. That's not good at all. So please don't do that. Don't listen to these people. His belief was that the path of health was to allow the digestive system to rest so the body could rid itself of toxins that cause bodily imbalances. You have an organ in your body that filters out toxins and detoxes your body for you, and that is called your liver. And I do believe your kidneys also do this. So there's no need to detoxify or detox your body of anything. You have organs that do that for you if they are in good working order. So if obviously if they're not working correctly, they don't work. So you do need to go see a doctor if that's the case. Not one like this though. This would be a thought that Linda would follow, as she believed this system restored her health. Linda moved to Minneapolis, where she started to work as an osteopath and spread her own, much more extreme version of the Dewey system. Linda would be very brazen, and she would even go so far as to claim that her fasting regimen could cure everything from toothaches and constipation to syphilis. Syphilis is an STI that needs to be treated with antibiotics, and it can kill you. When Linda moved to Minneapolis, she styled herself a doctor. She didn't go through medical school or anything like that. And in this day and age, there were medical schools. She just decided to call herself a doctor one day, and she became a doctor. She would join the healthcare game when Americans were exploring alternative therapies. One of the best known people at that time was, believe it or not, the cornflake king, John Kellogg. Linda's methods were way more sadistic and cruel than Kellogg's. Kellogg really prescribed to sexual abstinence, yogurt enemas, like, don't do that either, and hydrotherapy. Most of Linda's methods were pretty harsh and extreme, like I'm talking very extreme. They involved marathon fasts, back to back, starving yourself, basically. Brutal beatings that were called massages, vigorous walks. How anybody can vigorously walk when they haven't been eating for months on end is beyond me. And hours-long enemas. I really feel sorry for these people. Like, you have no idea how terrible I feel for them. And she also would prescribe almost scalding baths. Weirdly enough, some other patients actually did improve, and she did enjoy some success. That could be from literally anything, and it doesn't necessarily mean that her treatments were successful. It could mean that just these particular patients didn't have anything that would need medical intervention, and they could get better all by themselves. Like, most people get over a cold pretty quickly and without any intervention. So it could very well be something similar to that. This would be the beginning of deaths falling on Linda's shoulders, though. A woman named Gertrude Young would be one of the very first people who would die at Linda's hands. She was paralyzed on her right side from a stroke at some point, and despite getting help from other doctors, still struggled, which my grandmother had a stroke, and it was a struggle. Like, it was hard for her to do any kind of day-to-day living, and she needed assistance. And when you're, used to being able to help yourself and then all of a sudden you can't, it's difficult. She hoped for a miracle, which don't we all, and I thought she had found it in Linda Burfield. She began Linda's very strict fasting regimen in October 1902. It took 3 weeks for Gertrude's health to take a bad turn, and the nurse who worked with her contacted a Dr. U.G. Williams, who urged Gertrude to stop the regimen immediately. Unfortunately, Gertrude refused to break the fast and saying she couldn't before the 40th day. Gertrude would actually die on the 39th day of her fast on November 18th of 1902. Linda would actually attribute her death to her paralysis and did not take any kind of accountability for the treatment prescription that she gave Gertrude for her paralysis. She did, and this would 100% become Linda's MO. Dr. Williams was pissed, more or less, and ordered an inquest which found Gertrude's cause of death was starvation. And she was actually, her body weight was extremely low, and when she died, she was only 105 pounds, and she had nearly no blood left in her body. All of her valuable jewelry was found to be missing. Linda was suspected, but she denied any and all claims. She insisted under her care Gertrude was regaining movement on her paralyzed side. I am having a really hard time talking today. But she attributed her death to not following Linda's instructions to the letter. As I said, this would be Linda's explanation for the deaths for years to come. While she was in Minneapolis, Linda would meet Samuel Hazzard, who she would consider to be the love of her life. Hazzard was tall and handsome, according to sources, and he cut a pretty dashing figure with a mustache and a very straight posture. Hazzard was a West Point graduate and a former lieutenant with the Army. Don't let those accolades fool you, because Samuel Hazzard was just as shady as his wife. Apparently, Samuel Hazzard was going to be the perfect match for Linda. He regularly left unpaid bills. He forged several different documents and misappropriated Army funds while he was in the Army. And he was dishonorably discharged, I do believe. He was also previously married with children, but abandoned them and had, without even a care in the world, did not care that he had a wife and children out there. He also met and married another woman without getting divorced from his first wife. And there was even a trial involving Samuel for bigamy, because he was married to both Linda Burfield and an Iowa woman whose name was Viva Fitzpatrick. In 1904, Samuel was sent to prison for this bigamy, and even though Viva Fitzpatrick tried to make Samuel's prison stay easier, I think she was giving him money and making sure that he had like nice things and all kinds of stuff in there. Like she was a ride or die, but he was definitely not. Even though she was doing all this stuff, when he got released, he went straight to Linda. Linda was an extremely domineering woman, and she was very controlling of Samuel. The man did exactly everything she said to do. And he was, and he never argued with that. Like if she told him to jump, he would ask her how high, and he would try to attempt that height as hard as he could. And most of the time he did not succeed, because she was a woman who was probably very hard to please, and nothing anybody did was ever going to be correct. Samuel was also an extremely heavy alcoholic who would hide that fact by drinking bottles and bottles of vanilla extract. I couldn't figure out why, but I think that it had like an alcoholic effect. Vanilla extract did back then. I'm not sure if it does now still, but I would have to look into it a little bit more, and I should have, and I didn't, but that's okay. In 1907, Linda and Samuel Hazzard, moved from Minneapolis to Washington State. Linda was able to be grandfathered in to the whole medical practice thing due to a loophole for alternative medicine without degrees. So even though she technically wasn't a doctor in any way, shape, or form, because she practiced alternative medicine that wasn't technically like something that you would need a medical degree for, she was grandfathered into the Washington state laws and was allowed to practice her alternative medicine as a doctor. I'm fairly certain that loophole has since been closed, and that is not anything that, you can do anymore. I would at least hope so. And if it didn't, then that's an issue. And that is an issue for another day. And that's not an issue for me. Wilderness Heights Sanitarium was marketed to wealthy women to cure all of their ailments. It was a marketed as a quaint, relaxing hideaway that would be a dream come true for women and men desperate for help of any form. Whether they came to the sanitarium for minor things, tuberculosis or cancer, Linda Hazzard claimed to be able to cure them in a matter of weeks. Her treatments in Olalla, Washington, sanitarium included many of the same that she practiced in Minneapolis, which included feeding her patients just a single orange and some tomato juice a day. They might have had a small, like, not even a serving. I think it said like not even a cup of soup, like just like a sip of soup. She also continued the enemas and the daily massages, which again were basically just extremely violent beatings. Like basically she would get them on a table or do whatever. I'm not quite sure exactly what they would do, obviously, but I'm imagining them on like a massage table, and she's like saying like, oh yeah, you're gonna get this massage, and then she comes out with like, like starts beating on them with her fists, or she comes out with some kind of tool or something like that and starts beating on them with this tool, on a tool. Like that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking like they getting beat down for like their pocket change, which is literally kind of what she's doing. Anyway, most of her patients, and I use that term loosely because, like I said, even though she was grandfathered in, she's technically not a medical doctor, were found by Samuel, who would choose the ones who looked like they were the most wealthy, because I guess I guess back then you could tell who was the wealthiest by their appearance, because the wealthy back then, much as the wealthy nowadays, like to wear expensive clothing like furs and silks and stuff like that. And after he would find them, Linda would work them over before robbing them and defrauding them. She would also use the force of her personality to get them to sign all of their assets over to her. So, like I said, she's a pretty domineering and she was quite like, to do stuff like this to people, you have to be pretty charismatic. Like you have to be so charming and so like forceful that people are blinded to any of your faults, and they'll do basically everything that you say. Like being extremely charismatic can be both a good thing and a bad thing. And in this case, Linda was extremely charismatic. Plus, on top of the domineering personality that she had and the controlling personality that she had, it kind of would make people who didn't necessarily have that same kind of assertiveness just buckle right under the strain of just the force of her personality. And because of that, she got them to sign over so much stuff. Like in this day and age, most people that I know would absolutely say 100% fuck you to this woman. But then again, you never know. Like there might be some people out there who don't have that same kind of confidence and that same kind of assertiveness to be able to tell somebody who's trying to get them to sign over every single asset that they have to her for this treatment. They might not be able to tell them no. And so she banked on that, and she was, I hate to say it, but she was quite successful in that aspect of what is happening here. Is she banked on their, small personalities and their lack of assertiveness and their lack of confidence to be able to fund her hellhole of a sanitarium. So so they would sign all their assets over to her. If her patients, again, use the term loosely, didn't just outright die, most of them were left with injuries, extremely severe injuries. They were losing several pounds over a very short amount of time, and which that can be extremely dangerous for your health, period. They can cause heart attacks, strokes, everything like that. And many of Linda's victims, I'm probably going to use the terms patients and victims interchangeably, but when I say patients, think victims, because that's what they truly were. Many of Linda's victims were left with damage to their internal organs, which is As I said, like starvation can cause some pretty severe internal injuries to your various organs because it's absolutely necessary to have food and an appropriate balanced nutrition, diet to continue having these organs work appropriately and the way that they're supposed to. And if you're starving yourself, that doesn't happen. There were several occasions where Linda's victims were found fleeing her property in Olalla. They were described as being skeletal zombies, and passerbys would be absolutely shocked as these people would be begging for help when they escaped, or they would be begging for food. When Linda's victims did, how this continued after like all of this stuff happening is fucking wild to me. Like, I would imagine, like, nowadays, if somebody was seen like just absolutely skin and bones, hysterical, begging for help and begging for food, there would be all manner of things, like government agencies just descending on things to see what the fuck was happening. But in the early 1900s, apparently that kind of shit didn't happen. So we have this excessive stuff happening with Linda Hazzard that was never like looked into until, some pretty important people had gotten, well, I mean, I don't know if they were important, but they were important to their own families, but some other, some media and headlines and, like stuff like that were starting to be, that's just wild to me. When the victims did die, Linda would often use the cause of death, or she would list the cause of death as some pre-existing condition that they had, and not of the starvation that she put them through. As I said, like this was her MO for like the majority of everything that she did was to if they died, it was never her fault. She never took accountability for it. She never took responsibility for it. None of that kind of stuff. She absolutely would not agree or admit that her prescribed diet was the reason why these people were dying. So she would blame it on something just like random, some pre-existing condition, supposedly, like whatever, cancer or something like that. But it was never the starvation that killed them. It was always a pre-existing condition. None of Linda's patients or victims were allowed to leave her sanitarium. And if they wanted to do so, they would have to give Linda an absolute fucking fortune back then. Apparently, she had been planning to build a massive medical center where she could run her starvation treatment on a much larger and much grander scale. That was her end game, basically. So, yeah, like all of the people that died, she would steal all their money so that she could pool it into a fund to be able to build this huge, massive hospital. So she could do these kind of things to more people. I really, honestly, like, I don't think that this woman was in any way, shape, or form, like, knew that she was a doctor or thought she was a doctor. I think she was a psychopath, and I think that she was doing this on purpose. Like, I think, in my opinion, was doing these things on purpose. In 1911, Linda would get a hold of her biggest and brightest catch, quote unquote, yet. The sisters Claire and Dorothea Williamson would be considered the beginning of Linda's downfall. What was supposed to be a holiday for the two very wealthy heiresses from England would turn into a nightmare that would end in Claire's death. The sisters were quite taken with the idea of alternative medicine. That absolutely made them the perfect victims for Linda and her husband. The sisters were extremely wealthy, and they were from England, and they had been orphaned at an extremely young age. Dorothea, also called Dora, was older, and she was she was the mother figure to Claire, and she treated Claire more like a daughter than a younger sister. The pair were also said to be hypochondriacs, which plays right into Linda Hazzard's, game, I guess you could say. And they were the perfect marks for her. They would often insist that they were unwell, and they complained of all kinds of all manner of things, from aches and swollen glands to having a dropped uterus. I don't know what a dropped uterus means. I would assume it would be like a oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Prolapsed uterus, which usually only happens after childbirth. So I don't know why, I think it was Claire that they said had said that she had that. I don't know why she would assume that she would have something like that. While staying at a hotel in British Columbia, the sisters saw an ad for Linda Hazzard's Institute of Natural Therapeutics in Olalla, Washington. Claire was extremely convinced that Linda could cure them of every single illness that they had, every single ailment, every single thing that they thought was wrong with them. Claire was absolutely 100% convinced that Linda Hazzard's treatment would cure them of everything. The reality of what the sisters would endure was a stark contrast to the beautiful countryside with horses grazing and wildlife all around them that they were expecting. When the sisters arrived in February 1911 in Olalla, they found the sanitarium was incomplete. So they rented an apartment in Seattle, and Linda would prescribe them 1 cup of unseasoned tomato or asparagus broth. Not even with the vegetable, like chunks of vegetables in there, but just the broth, twice a day. They were only allowed to eat this twice a day. They were also allowed some tiny sips of orange juice and nothing else. So we're talking a cup. Like, everybody knows how big a cup is. It's not that big. And it was supposed to be tomato soup or broth. So my guess is it would be tomatoes or asparagus boiled in water, removed from the water, and then they basically just drank the water, a cup of the water that the vegetables boiled in. That's what a broth is. That's not enough to sustain anybody. That's not even enough to sustain a rabbit, in my opinion. Yeah, and the orange juice, I don't know why she would prescribe orange juice. I mean, like, there's vitamins and nutrients and stuff like that in oranges. You can get some pretty high concentrates of potassium and stuff, but a sip is not going to be enough. The sisters would also go through violent osteopathic treatments and hours-long enemas. It got to this to such a bad place with these treatments that a canvas sling was installed across the bathtub, the tub that they were receiving their treatments in, to catch them because they were starting to faint during the treatments. They would, if you are this episode, like, the research that I did for this episode, like, it made me angry. Like, I was so angry about all of this kind of stuff. Anyway, the sisters would waist all the way down to 70 pounds. At this point, they would remain in the apartment in Seattle for a little while longer, before they were actually removed from the apartment and taken to the sanitarium. They were carried, mind you, 2 ambulances, covered up, faces and hands, so people couldn't see what they looked like, because the nurses were so shocked and appalled by the sight of their hands and their faces that they covered them up so people couldn't see them. That tells you right there that the problem was immense, like, it was large. Especially because these were the nurses who were completing the treatments with these women. The sanitarium itself was nothing like they might have expected. If they'd been, like, lucid and not basically just, their brains were dying because they didn't have any nutrients. Instead of all of that beautiful countryside that they were expecting, they got a sanitarium that consisted of nothing more than a simple frame house. Sorry, I was drinking some more coffee. That the Hazzards lived in, and 5 very small, very shittily built cabins. Hazzard had already been working on them before they'd even come to Olalla, though. So like it was like nothing, like they didn't even care. Like they were so like, I don't know, loopy from starving themselves and having to listen to Linda and, having all of her very forceful personality pushed on them. I don't even think that even if they had been lucid when they'd gotten to the sanitarium that it would have changed anything. She had convinced them, mind you, she had convinced them to give her their jewels and codicil and create codices. That's a very difficult word. Codices to their world. A codicil is a modification. Why they can't just call it a modification, I don't know. Is a modification to an already existing will without having to prepare a whole entirely new one. So she had them do this to their wills so she could basically become the executors and like the beneficiary of their will. Linda repeatedly told Claire that Dora had lost her mind and could no longer take care of herself, mind you. The Williamson sisters were too weak to argue, and they absolutely fell right underneath her heel. They didn't cause a fuss. They didn't cause a ruckus. They didn't cause any kind of trouble when Linda was doing this to them. So she was able to just do some pretty horrific things to these women. The sisters hadn't told anybody where they were going because they didn't want anyone to make fun of them and their latest health fad. And that is terrible. Like when I read that, I was just like, how sad is it that they didn't want to tell their families where they were going to a place they'd never been to because their families just made fun of them all the time. Like you have to remember, like they're extremely wealthy, orphaned, not even raised by their parents, had all of these hypochondriac issues and stuff like that. And the people that should have been helping them the most were making fun of them. And because of that, I, in my opinion, it's not a direct cause, but it's definitely a correlation into their deaths. Because if they had been able to trust their family members to tell them where they were going, some of this might not have even happened. Claire might be alive, so if your kids or your family do strange things that you think are strange, don't be harsh in judgment to them. Like validate what they are interested in and show some interest in it. So something like this might not happen because they'll have enough trust in you to be able to come to you and tell you things that are happening, or like, I'm going here because I like to do this, and you'll know where they are and you'll know if they're safe or not. So treat people with respect and validate their interests and stuff. Unless they're murderers, don't do that. Validate their interests and make sure that you create yourself as a safe place for them to go to be able to express that stuff, so that that they're safe and they don't have something like what happened to the Williamson sisters happen to them. Just be nice to people. Linda had wrapped them up so tightly with her manipulations, it's pretty unlikely, as I said, that they would have eaten a single bit of food if it had been offered to them without Linda saying so. It was a desperate letter written by one of the sisters. My sources that I found differed on whether it was Dora that had written the letter or Claire that had written the letter. But the letter was written to a governess that they had in childhood, that would kind of shed a little bit of light on the situation. The letter itself didn't shed any light on the situation, like none whatsoever. But the woman coming to Olalla absolutely did. And this precipitated all of the things that would happen next. A cable was sent to a woman named Margaret Conway that said, "Come SS," this is a direct quote from the cable, "Come SS Marima, May 8th, first class, Claire." This was sent to Margaret Conway, and she was a woman, and the woman was so worried, Margaret was so worried by what this cryptic cable said that she immediately went to the next berth of the Marima and set sail for the America. And because I think Margaret was, I think she was in England at this time. I don't think she had gone to Australia, because the woman herself was Australian. Um, when Samuel, weirdly enough, when Samuel picked Margaret up at the docks at the ship, she was met with some pretty devastating news. By the time she had made it to Washington, Claire was deceased. And to quote Samuel, Miss Dora was helplessly insane. When Margaret viewed Claire's body at a Seattle mortuary, she found that, surprisingly and strangely to her, the body actually looked wrong, like it wasn't correct. The hair color was incorrect, and she said that the hands didn't look at all like they should. Um, she claims that this body was, she did not think this body was Claire. And during the trial of, spoiler alert, Linda Hazzard gets caught and she goes to trial. Anyway, at the trial, the prosecutors would surmise that the Hazards actually paid to have Claire's body switched for a healthier looking body, and Claire's body was more than likely to be cremated. They believe that the Hazards received consent from Claire for cremation should she pass away. I honestly don't think Dora or Claire were in their right minds and had any cognitive ability at that point in time to make any kind of important decisions for their lives or their afterlives, Hazzard had performed an autopsy on Claire at the time of her death, and Linda Hazzard was more than willing to share those results with everybody in Sunder. Instead of the starvation that Claire had undergone for 80 days, that's a long time. It doesn't seem like a long time, but that's a long time. Linda blamed it on a medication that Claire had been taking in childhood. She claimed that this medication had shrunk Claire's organs and caused cirrhosis of the liver. I don't know that there's a medication out there or had been out there that could possibly shrink your organs. But there is medication that can cause cirrhosis of the liver. So I don't know. I would have to definitely look into that because I've said it before. I should have looked into it, but I didn't look into it. And maybe I will because I'm very interested in that. Dora, at the time of Claire's death and when Margaret saw her, was only 50 pounds. I will absolutely 100% share on the Instagram pictures and images of Claire and Dora before all of this happened. So you can imagine, because I don't think that, I'll have to look, but I don't think that there is any images of Dora at this weight. But I will have to look and see if I can find them. But the images that they have before all of this happened, you can just imagine how absolutely frail and skeletal this woman would have been at 50 pounds. I don't know. Toddlers weigh 50 pounds, a toddler will weigh 50 pounds. 50 pounds for an adult woman is very small. Like I'm surprised she also did not die. So she was so thin and frail, her bones protruded so much that sitting down was excruciatingly painful for her. Dora was still so immersed in Linda's manipulations, though, that she wouldn't leave even after losing her sister to starvation. Margaret couldn't do much from the sanitarium because she was not an upper class citizen, and so she didn't have a lot of sway, and she couldn't really do much of anything. But she did sneak some rice and cream into Dora's, tomato and asparagus broth to give her some kind of nutrients. But she did know, and she absolutely believed that if she did not get somebody to help her remove Dora from the situation, Dora would absolutely die. Margaret would end up sending a cable to the Williamsons' uncle who lived in Portland, Oregon. So John Herbert was their uncle, and he would come as fast as he could to get his niece, to get Dora. The Hazards would not release her to him whatsoever. And he ended up having to pay them almost $1,000 to have her released. $1,000 in the early 1900s was about today would have been about 300 and like $33,000. So he had to pay them a ransom to have his niece, his legal biological niece, removed from their care and placed into his own care. He had to pay them, who were not legal doctors, who were not even lawyers, who were not in any way, shape, or form, anything, you know, what's the word, like official. He had to pay them a ransom to save Dora's life. And they were also, at that time, they learned that Linda had made herself, as I said, executor of Claire's estate and Dora's guardian. And she actually made herself Dora's guardian for life. She, at some point, they had convinced Dora to give power of attorney to Samuel Hazzard. That's the first time I've heard any kind of, other than him trying to like find Linda's victims. That's the first time that I had seen, gleaned from sources that he had anything other to, more to do with things. The couple, actually, because they're disgusting people, the couple took many of Claire's dresses, like her silk dresses and expensive dresses and stuff, silk and satin dresses, and close to $6,000 worth of jewelry. I don't know if that's $6,000 worth in the early 1900s or $6,000 worth now. But if it was $6,000 worth in the 1900s, that was probably in excess of $200,000 worth of jewelry now in this day and age. Linda would straight up wear Claire's dresses in front of Dora and Margaret because she's a class A fucking bitch. God, if this woman was standing right in front of me right now, I'd probably punch her in her face. If the British consulate hadn't gotten involved with this entire thing, because you got to remember, Claire and Dora Williamson were actually British citizens on holiday to the United States while all of this was happening. So the British consul got involved, and if they hadn't, Linda probably would have gotten away with everything. C.E. Lucien Agassiz, who was a member of the British consul, was able to undo the guardianship on Dora. So no longer was Linda was no longer Dora's guardian for life. And he was, with the help of John Herbert, along with John Herbert, he actually was the one who instigated a court case against the Hazards. An investigation during that time found a trail of wealthy patients who all had died under suspicious circumstances under Linda's care. Some had even signed over large sections of their estates to the Hazards. One of them had been a former state legislator named L.E. Rader, whose land the sanitarium was actually built on. Rader had died May 1911, so he died before before Claire, and I think it was like right after the girls came to Seattle and began all of this treatment with Linda. He died after wasting down to just under 100 pounds and on a 5'11" frame. That's pretty bad. Apparently Rader had moved to a very secret location before any authority could question him, and then he died. There was a British man named John Flux, and he died with only about $70 to his name after treatment with the Hazards. He had come to America to buy a ranch, so I'm assuming this man was extremely wealthy. And that's what he came to America to do. And then by the time he died, he had $70 in his pocket and I'm assuming was just as skeletal as the rest. Another man reportedly shot himself while under their care. Kitsap County would arrest the Hazzards on August 15th, 1911, and charged her with first-degree murder of Claire. Her servants and nurses at the sanitarium weren't as loyal as one might expect, which thankfully I'm glad for. They all testified about the brutality that the Williams sisters endured beginning January, and this trial began in January 1912 in Port Orchard, Washington. Prosecutors would highlight the financial starvation the pair would also go through. Linda, the bitch, was only concerned that the trial was an attack on her success as a businesswoman who practiced in a male-dominated field. She was quoted as saying something along the lines of, like, this is an attack on my gender, and I will always basically do anything in my power to protect that and champion women, whatever. She's a fucking crackpot. Like, she did this deliberately. Like, I think she was a psychopath, and I think and most people use that term loosely, but I think she got some form of pleasure out of doing this to people, and she was, she did it on purpose. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It might have started innocuous and all that kind of stuff, but after she started, like, getting them to sign over assets and wealth and jewelry and money and land and all that kind of stuff, she became a serial killer in stop. Like, she became that person who killed people to get what she wanted. Like, that's what she was. She did this all on purpose. She starved them to death on purpose. You can't convince me otherwise. Jurors would deliberate for an extremely short time while before delivering a guilty verdict of manslaughter. The sentence would be 2 to 20 years of hard labor at the Walla Walla Penitentiary, and her medical license was revoked completely. Wildly enough, there were letters and a petition that had 121 names from New Zealand asking for Hazzard's release. There was an appeal to the Supreme Court to have her released, and that was 100% rejected. But this part pisses me off too. After only a year and a half of serving her time, Governor Ernest Lister pardoned Hazzard with the stipulation that she leave America and never come back. Linda and Samuel would set out for New Zealand, where she would work as a physician, dietitian, and osteopath again. She even published another book. They were extremely successful in New Zealand and were even able to move back to Olalla in 1920. That angers me so much that she was pardoned by this governor. Like, oh my God. Because effectively, like, when they're governed, like, then when they're pardoned, like, all of their crimes are, like, washed away and, swept under the rug and forgotten about. Anyway, when they came back into Olalla in 1920, they built a bigger sanitarium, and Hazzard called it the School of Health, and her patients were her patients/victims were called her students. And she did this because she couldn't practice medicine anymore in Washington State, like, no matter what. It was revoked, but in stop, that's it. So she called this new sanitarium a school because, that's not being a doctor, that's being a teacher, right? Shitty. She received a $100 fine for practicing medicine without a license while starving a Washington farmer to death. This woman, see, I'm telling you, this is why I tell you that this starvation was her form, that was her method of killing people. Like, some people out there, like some serial killers, their method of killing their victims is strangulation or, stabbing them or whatever. Her method of disposing of her victims was starvation. This is in my opinion, this was a heavier, more extremely crueler and more vindictive way to kill people is starving them to death. Because it's fucking awful. Like, that's terrible. Hazzard School would actually burn down in 1935 under suspicious circumstances. My guess is one of her students probably died and it pissed somebody off. And they put two and two together, and instead of putting it through the justice system, which I don't blame them for not wanting to, considering the absolute shit show of the first, shit that she had gone through, the fact that she was pardoned by the governor. She only served a year and a half, and she was allowed, even though she was told not to come back, she was allowed to come back. Like, that's an absolute misfire of justice, if you ask me. Anyway, somebody probably got pissed off and burned her building down. Don't blame them. I probably would have done the same thing. Hazzard would actually become her very own last victim at the age of 70. She attempted to cure herself of something. They didn't specify what she was trying to cure. I'm guessing old age. She tried to cure herself by fasting, and she died of starvation in 1938. By the end of it, there were 18 confirmed people who died under her care, but the true number is estimated to be as high as 40. Like, that's a lot of victims to be having. The old building, the original sanitarium, actually still stands. And it's said to be haunted. When a former resident who used to live, obviously they used to live there because that's what resident means, Jennifer. When a former resident was cooking, she was moving back and forth, between the counter and the oven as one does as they're cooking. And when her back was turned to the bathroom door that was also, off the kitchen, she apparently every chair in the kitchen was piled against the door, and when she turned back around, it was there, like, and she has no idea how that happened. Like, how does that happen? And so there's that. And a psychic who visited the building insisted she could see Hazzard's victims sitting on ledges in the attic. There was like little shelf ledges that, like for storage or display or whatever, up there. And she said that she could see them sitting there. And it's also said that this woman became hysterical at the anguish that she could feel in that little house. I have opinions about psychics and mediums, but I don't want to color that. But if she truly felt, like, I could just imagine the anguish and the pain and the suffering that it just permeates that home's walls and the cabin. Like, if there's cabins left, those from all of the people who suffered under Linda Hazzard's hands. The Washington State Paranormal Investigations and Research were able to get videos and audio evidence of hauntings at this Starvation Heights. They recorded a voice asking for help, and while investigating, I cannot read my own handwriting, I'm telling you. While investigating a ravine that Hazzard was supposedly hid bodies, they caught voices stating, "Are you talking about me now? Take us up and dig us up or dig us up," which is absolutely heartbreaking. Linda Hazzard was a brash and brazen woman who used hell to prey on people desperate for cures. She killed without remorse, and she stole so much more than money and jewels from her victims. And that is the story of Linda Hazzard in Starvation Heights in Olalla, Washington. Like I said, she might have begun all of this stuff in, under the guise of health and wanting to help people, and it might have started that way, but it quickly turned into murder. Like, that's what it was. If she hadn't been having these people sign over all of their assets to her, it probably would have been chalked up as to accidental deaths. But the fact is, she was having people sign over all of their stuff to her, and then they were dying. So in my opinion, and I'm by no means am I an expert or any of that kind of professional or any of that kind of stuff, but in my opinion, that gives her motive to kill people, because she learned that if she did all that kind of stuff and they died, then she got to keep their things. So she had them do this, and then she slowly starved them to death. Starving to death is a terrible way to die. it's up there with burning to death and drowning, like, in my opinion. So what she did to these people was just fucking horrendous. And the fact that she, not only did she starve them, but she also like abused them, like physically abused them by forcing them to undergo hours long enemas. Like, do you know what an enema is? An enema is something that induces shitting. Like, you basically are pooping like constantly. So not only did they starve to death, but they were basically shitting themselves to death too. Like, that's fucking terrible. She was just an awful human being, and I'm glad that she was her own victim. Like, honestly, she was just terrible. And that was just absolutely a misfire of justice. She should never have been pardoned. She should have had to serve out her full sentence for the people that she killed. I mean, it was confirmed, 18 people confirmed that died under her care, and I am of the mind that she did it on purpose, and so that she could get their assets and have their assets. Like, all signs point to that. So anyway, this is a longer episode than I normally do. My clock is clocked at an hour, so that's fantastic. I almost did it in two parts. Like, I almost did a part 1 and a part 2, but then I just got to going and decided not to do that. And so here we are, an hour later. I very much apologize for all of the cement tongue I had in there and the inability to speak and all of that kind of nonsense. But yeah, so that was an interesting episode, and the research was quite fun. I still have the Instagram, and that's spooky PNW podcast. We still have the email going. That's spookypnwpod@gmail.com. I have not started a TikTok. I was thinking about it, but I haven't yet. And we also have the Patreon, which I'll link to in the show notes. And yeah, I mean, thanks for coming. And I've also decided that I am going to do some recommendations, some listening recommendations. I listened to another podcast, and they started doing this, and I thought it was a really good idea. So I'm going to copy them and shout them out in my show notes. Anyway, if you like listening to other, folklore and tales of other cultures, I absolutely 100% recommend a Spooky Tales on Spotify. There are a couple of Hispanic women who go and they tell spooky stories that are all around the Latin countries like Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador. I think they did some in like South America too, like Chile and Brazil. But I definitely recommend their podcast. It's funny. They're funny. I think they're funny. You might not think they're funny, but I do. And I also, if you have TikTok, I also recommend watching Latinos Against Spooky Shit. The dude is funny. Like, he is hilarious. He watches, little spooky clips and vines on TikTok and then has something to say about it. It's hilarious. He's a hilarious guy. I'll link that the Spooky Tales and Latinos Against Spooky Shit in the show notes if I can do that with a TikTok. But listen to them, watch them, have a good time. Next week, I don't know. Next week is I start my second master's on Monday. So I might not have an episode next week. I'm not sure yet. If I do, I'm going to try something. I'm going to possibly do something that's much shorter. Definitely not an hour, but something that's much shorter, maybe 30 minutes or so. But yeah, keep it spooky. Thanks for coming. Don't mind all my tongue twisting and inability to read my own handwriting. That will never change. Thanks for bearing with me. Come again. Have fun. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks.